A war once started because a dog decided to chase something across a border, costing dozens of lives. Another huge conflict, involving navies and armies, was reportedly kicked off because someone's ear got lopped off and shown to politicians. And, believe it or not, 2 cities fought a bloody battle, leaving thousands dead, all because of a common wooden bucket that went missing. Number 9. The Kettle War, when one potshot ended a war before dinner. Imagine a war where the only casualty was a soup kettle. Sounds like a joke, right? But in 1784, something very much like this actually happened between the Holy Roman Empire, basically a big collection of territories in Central Europe led by Austria at the time, and the much smaller Dutch Republic, or what we now know as the Netherlands. This tiny spat got its quirky name, the Kettle War, or Kettelerlog in Dutch, for a very specific and slightly steamy reason. The whole fuss was about a river, the Scheldt. For many, many years, since way back in 1648, the Dutch had a special agreement that basically said they controlled who could sail in and out of the Scheldt estuary. This was super important because the Scheldt led to the major port city of Antwerp, which was then part of the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium. The Dutch, with their booming port of Amsterdam, weren't too keen on Antwerp becoming a big competitor again. So they kept the river closed to international shipping. Enter Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was an ambitious ruler, full of new ideas, and he really wanted to get Antwerp back on its feet as a major trading hub. He thought the Dutch control over the Scheldt was unfair and outdated. So he decided to test the waters, quite literally. He told the Dutch he was done with the old agreement and that his ships were going to sail. In October 1784, Joseph II ordered 3 ships to sail down the Scheldt from Antwerp towards the sea, basically daring the Dutch to do something. The main ship leading this little convoy was called Le Louis, and it was flying the flag of the Holy Roman Empire. The Dutch had forts along the river and ships patrolling, and they weren't about to let these imperial vessels just cruise on by. A Dutch ship named Dauphine, a man-of-war, spotted Le Louis. The Dutch captain, Willem van Sitters, was under orders to uphold Dutch sovereignty. The Dauphine fired a warning shot. The Louis didn't stop. So, the Dauphine fired again. This second shot wasn't aimed to cause massive damage or sink the ship. Instead, the cannonball flew across the deck of Le Louis and, as fate would have it, struck a large soup kettle that was probably getting ready for someone's meal. Kettle was shattered. Soup likely went everywhere, but incredibly, no one was hurt. Commander of Le Louis, seeing that the Dutch were serious and perhaps not wanting to escalate things into a full-blown bloody naval battle over his emperor's orders, decided to surrender. That was it. The great challenge to Dutch control of the Scheldt ended with 1 cannonball and a ruined dinner. The other imperial ships also turned back. When news of this attack reached Joseph II, he was reportedly furious. He felt insulted. He started making loud noises about a full-scale war against the Dutch. Armies were mobilized, and for a while, it looked like things might get very serious. But other European powers, particularly France, weren't eager to see a major conflict erupt over this. France stepped in to mediate between the Austrians and the Dutch. After some negotiations, the Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed in 1785. The Dutch actually had to pay a hefty sum of money to Austria, several million guilders, as compensation. They also had to give up some of their forts along the Scheldt. However, the crucial part for them was that the Scheldt remained closed to international shipping. So Joseph II got some cash and a bit of pride salved. But he didn't get his main goal of opening Antwerp to the world. The Dutch, despite the payment, kept their strategic advantage. And so the Kettle War, A conflict that threatened to engulf parts of Europe ended with a single decisive shot that took out nothing more than a piece of kitchenware. It serves as a peculiar footnote in history, showing how even big international disputes can sometimes hinge on the smallest and oddest of incidents. The river itself would eventually be opened up, but not until many years later, during the French Revolutionary Wars. The legend of the kettle lived on. Number 8. The Emu War. That time, Australia declared war on birds and lost. In 1932, Australia faced a rather unusual enemy. Not a foreign power, not rebels, but birds. Big, flightless birds, specifically emus. And this wasn't just a pest control problem. It was declared somewhat officially as the Emu War. The strange part: the emus, in a way, won. Here's how it all went down. After World War I, many ex-soldiers from Australia, and some British veterans too, were given land in Western Australia to become farmers. They were encouraged to grow wheat. Things were tough, and then the Great Depression hit, making farming even harder. As if economic woes weren't enough, a new problem arrived in massive numbers. Around 20,000 emus. These large, long-legged birds were migrating inland for breeding, and they discovered that the newly cultivated farmlands in the Campion district were a fantastic source of food and water. They started feasting on the wheat crops and also damaged fences, which then allowed other pests like rabbits to get in and cause even more destruction. The farmers were desperate. They had served their country in a real war, and now they felt they were losing the battle on their own farms. They appealed to the government for help. A delegation of these soldier settlers went to see the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce. Since these farmers were ex-military, they had an idea: use machine guns against the emus. Sir George Pearce, perhaps seeing a chance for some unusual target practice, or genuinely wanting to help, agreed. He authorized the deployment of troops from the Royal Australian Artillery. The military operation was to be led by Major G.P.W. Meredith. He was given 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. A small contingent of soldiers was assigned to him. There was even a Fox movie-tone cinematographer sent along to capture the action, perhaps expecting a glorious victory over the feathered foes. The first attempt to engage the enemy occurred in early November 1932. The soldiers tried to herd a flock of about 50 emus into an ambush. But the emus proved to be surprisingly clever. They split into smaller groups and scattered, making them difficult targets. The machine guns, designed for warfare against humans, weren't ideal for fast-moving, erratic birds. The first day resulted in only a number of birds killed. A few days later, Major Meredith and his men located a much larger group, perhaps 1,000 emus, near a dam. This time, they hoped for better results. They set up the machine guns and opened fire. But once again, the emus showed remarkable resilience. The first sound of gunfire, they scattered in all directions. To make matters worse, one of the machine guns jammed after only a few birds were hit. The official report noted the birds faced machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. Major Meredith himself was quoted observing the emus' tactics. "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." The soldiers found that the emus were tough. Even when hit, they often kept running. It took multiple bullets to bring one down. The campaign continued for several days, with very limited success. Reports suggest that after nearly a week of war, with thousands of rounds fired, The number of confirmed emu kills was incredibly low, perhaps only a few dozen to a couple of hundred, depending on the source. The initial estimate of 20,000 emus seemed barely dented. The media started to report on the Emu War, and not always favorably. Some questioned the use of military resources against birds, especially when the results were so poor. There were concerns about animal cruelty too. By mid-November, less than a month after it began, Major Meredith and his men were recalled. The Minister of Defense officially announced the withdrawal. The Emu War was over, and the emus were, by most accounts, the victors. The farmers were, understandably, not happy. The emu problem persisted. Later requests for military aid were turned down. Instead, the government implemented a bounty system, offering money for each emu killed. This proved to be much more effective over the following years, with tens of thousands of emus culled by farmers and hunters. The official military campaign of 1932 remains a curious and somewhat embarrassing episode in Australian history, a time when the army took on nature, and nature, in the form of a very large bird, seemed to outsmart them. Number 7. The 335 Years' War, the war that lasted centuries, and nobody fired a shot. Imagine a war declared but then completely forgotten about for over 3 centuries. A war with no battles, no deaths, no injuries, and no damage. This isn't a legend. It's the story of the 335 Years' War between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly, a tiny group of islands off the southwestern tip of Cornwall, England, often cited as one of the longest wars in history, and certainly one of the most peaceful. To understand how this odd situation came about, we need to go back to the mid-17th century, during the English Civil War. This was a messy conflict fought between the Royalists, who supported King Charles I, and the Parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell. The Netherlands, at the time a powerful maritime nation, had sided with the Parliamentarians because the Royalists had been causing them a lot of trouble at sea, preying on their shipping. By 1651, the Royalists were losing badly. Much of England was under Cromwell's control. One of the last holdouts for the Royalist cause was their fleet, which had retreated to the Isles of Scilly. These islands were owned by Sir John Granville, a staunch Royalist. From this base, the Royalist ships continued to harass Dutch merchant vessels. The Dutch were, quite understandably, fed up. Their trade was suffering. So they decided to take action. Admiral Martin Harperdson Tromp, a famous Dutch naval hero, sailed with his fleet to the Isles of Scilly. He arrived on March 30th, 1651, and demanded that the Royalists on Scilly pay reparations for the damage done to Dutch shipping and goods. The Royalists on Scilly, probably not having the resources or the inclination to pay up, gave an unsatisfactory answer. So, according to the historical accounts, Admiral Tromp, acting on behalf of the United Provinces of the Netherlands, officially declared war. But here's the catch. He declared war specifically on the Isles of Scilly, not on England as a whole, because most of England was already allied with the Dutch. It was a very localized declaration of war against this small Royalist outpost. What happened next is key to why this war became so strange. Just a few months later, in June 1651, the Royalist fleet on Scilly surrendered to the Parliamentarian forces under Admiral Robert Blake. The English Civil War on the islands was over. With the Royalists gone, the original reason for the Dutch declaration of war against Scilly effectively vanished. And then, everyone just sort of forgot. The Dutch fleet sailed away, having achieved their aim of neutralizing the Royalist naval threat from Scilly, even if it was the Parliamentarians who delivered the final blow. There was no fighting between the Dutch and Scilly. No shots were fired in this particular war. No peace treaty was ever signed because, in the grand scheme of things and with the rapidly changing political landscape, this minor declaration against a tiny group of islands just slipped through the cracks. The Netherlands and England as a whole went on to have other conflicts and alliances, but the specific state of war with the Isles of Scilly remained unaddressed and unnoticed, on some forgotten ledger. Centuries passed. Kings and queens came and went. Empires rose and fell, and still technically the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly were at war. It wasn't until 1985 that this historical curiosity was rediscovered. Roy Duncan, a historian and the chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, stumbled upon references to this centuries-old declaration of war. He realized that, as far as anyone could tell, peace had never formally been declared. He wrote to the Dutch embassy in London to inquire about it. The Dutch authorities looked into their records and lo and behold confirmed that, yes, it seemed they were still technically at war with this small part of Britain. Everyone agreed this was a rather amusing state of affairs. So, on April 17th, 1986, almost exactly 335 years after Admiral Tromp's declaration, Jonkheer Rijn-Hoytetoper, the Dutch ambassador to the United Kingdom, traveled to the Isles of Scilly and officially signed a peace treaty. The ceremony was a cheerful and slightly quacky affair. Ambassador Hoytetoper joked that it must have been harrowing for the Scillonians to know we could have attacked at any moment. The war had lasted for 3 centuries, 3 decades and 5 years, all without a single casualty or a moment of hostility after its initial declaration. It's a wonderful reminder that sometimes history can have a very gentle sense of humor. Number 6. The Pig War, when a potato-stealing pig almost caused an international crisis. In the summer of 1859, on a small island nestled between mainland United States and Vancouver Island, which was then British territory, a pig's fondness for potatoes nearly sparked a war between 2 of the world's great powers, the United States and Great Britain. This peculiar standoff became known quite fittingly as the Pig War. And yes, a pig was the only casualty. The root of the problem lay in a map and some unclear wording. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 was supposed to settle the border dispute between the U.S. and British North America, what would later become Canada, in the Pacific Northwest. Treaty declared that the border would follow the 49th parallel west to the middle of the channel, separating Vancouver Island from the continent, and then southerly through the middle of said channel and of Fuca's Straits to the Pacific Ocean. Problem was, there wasn't just one channel. There were several, weaving through a cluster of islands known as the San Juan Islands. Both the U.S. and Britain claimed these islands, particularly San Juan Island itself, which was strategically located. So, settlers from both nations began to occupy San Juan Island. The British Hudson's Bay Company established a sheep ranch there, called Bellevue Farm. American settlers also arrived, staking claims and starting farms. Tensions were present, but things remained mostly peaceful, if a little awkward. Then came June 15, 1859. An American farmer named Lyman Cutler went out to his potato patch and found a rather large black pig belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company, rooting around and eating his prized tubers. This wasn't the first time. Cutler was fed up. He shot and killed the pig. Charles Griffin, an Irishman, who managed the Hudson's Bay Company farm and was the pig's owner, was not pleased. Cutler offered to pay $10 for the pig. Griffin, however, demanded $100, claiming it was a prize boar. Cutler retorted that the pig was eating his potatoes and he wouldn't pay that much. Griffin reportedly told Cutler, "It is up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig." The argument escalated. British authorities asserting their jurisdiction over the island, threatened to arrest Cutler. The American settlers on the island, feeling threatened, called for U.S. military protection. This is where things started to get serious. Brigadier General William S. Harney, the anti-British commander of the U.S. Army's Department of Oregon, responded with gusto. He sent a company of the 9th U.S. Infantry under Captain George Pickett. Yes, the same Pickett who would later lead Pickett's charge at Gettysburg to San Juan Island in late July. Pickett's orders were to protect American citizens and prevent the British from attempting to enforce their laws on Americans. He declared the island under U.S. military occupation. The British were not amused. James Douglas, the governor of British Columbia, dispatched 3 British warships under Captain Geoffrey Hornby to the area in response to the American military presence. Pickett refused to let them land. For a while, it looked like things could really blow up. Captain Pickett famously said, "We'll make a Bunker Hill of it," showing his readiness for a fight. The number of soldiers on both sides grew. By mid-August, nearly 500 American soldiers with cannons faced off against a superior British naval force with over 2,000 men and more than 70 guns on their ships. Fortunately, cooler heads began to prevail, especially among the naval commanders on site. Rear Admiral Robert L. Baines, commander of the British naval forces in the Pacific, arrived and was horrified that a full-blown war could erupt over a dead pig and a patch of potatoes. He instructed Captain Hornby not to land his Marines or engage the Americans, reportedly saying it would be foolish to involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. Both Pickett's and Hornby's superiors had also given strict orders to avoid firing the first shot. Back in Washington, D.C., news of the escalating crisis caused alarm. President James Buchanan sent General Winfield Scott, the U.S. Army's top general, to negotiate a peaceful resolution with Governor Douglas. Scott and Douglas managed to agree on a temporary solution: a joint military occupation of San Juan Island. Each nation would maintain a small force of no more than 100 men on the island, coexisting until a final agreement on the border could be reached. This joint occupation lasted for the next 12 years. The American camp and the British Royal Marines camp were established on opposite ends of the island. And remarkably, despite the initial tension, the soldiers got along quite well. They reportedly visited each other's camps, celebrated holidays together, and generally maintained a friendly atmosphere. Finally, in 1871, the United States and Great Britain signed the Treaty of Washington, which, among other things, referred the San Juan border dispute to international arbitration. Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany was chosen as the arbitrator. In 1872, the Kaiser ruled in favor of the United States, determining that the border should run through the Haro Strait to the west of the San Juan Islands, thus granting all the islands, including San Juan, to the U.S. The British peacefully withdrew their Marines in November 1872, and the Americans took full possession. Pig War officially ended without any human casualties, a testament to restraint in diplomacy, even if its trigger was one hungry pig. The only life lost was that of the unfortunate porker, whose appetite for potatoes set the whole strange affair in motion. Number 5. The War of the Stray Dog, the dog that accidentally started a border war. Sometimes, the smallest incidents can ignite the biggest fires, especially when there's already a lot of dry tinder lying around. In October 1925, a seemingly minor event involving a Greek soldier and his runaway dog on the tense border between Greece and Bulgaria quickly escalated into an international crisis, leading to an invasion and intervention by the League of Nations. This bizarre episode became known as the War of the Stray Dog, or the Incident at Petrich. The backdrop to this canine-sparked conflict was a period of very strained relations between Greece and Bulgaria. Two Balkan nations had a history of disputes over territory, particularly in the volatile region of Macedonia. There were rival claims, memories of past wars, like the Second Balkan War and World War I, where they had fought on opposing sides, and frequent armed incursions by complexities, irregular armed bands, across the poorly defined border. So, soldiers on both sides were constantly on edge. The spark occurred on October 19, 1925, near the Bulgarian border town of Petric. According to Greek accounts, a Greek soldier stationed at a border post ran after his dog, which had darted across the frontier into Bulgarian territory. Other versions suggest the soldier himself may have crossed the border for some reason, or that he was trying to retrieve the dog which was running away from him. Whatever the exact details concerning the dog's intentions or the soldier's primary motivation, the outcome was tragic. Bulgarian sentries, seeing a Greek soldier on or very near their territory, opened fire and shot him dead. This single death immediately inflamed the situation. The Greek government, led by the dictator General Theodoros Pangalos, claimed that Bulgarian soldiers had fired without provocation from a Bulgarian border post on a Greek sentry who was on Greek soil. They issued an ultimatum to Bulgaria, demanding an official apology, punishment for those responsible for the shooting, and a hefty indemnity, compensation payment, of 2 million French francs. Bulgaria was given 48 hours to comply. Bulgaria expressed regret over the incident, proposed a mixed Greek-Bulgarian commission to investigate the facts, and argued that the shooting was a misunderstanding in a tense border area. They were willing to pay some compensation if their soldiers were found to be at fault after an impartial inquiry, but they found the Greek demands excessive and the ultimatum too aggressive. When the deadline passed, without Bulgaria fully complying with the Greek demands, Greece took military action. On October 22nd, Greek forces invaded Bulgaria, occupying Petric and several surrounding villages. Their stated aim was to enforce their demands and ensure border security. The Bulgarian army offered some resistance, but they were under orders to avoid a full-scale confrontation if possible, hoping for international intervention. This is where the newly formed League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, stepped in. Bulgaria appealed to the League, protesting the Greek invasion of its territory. The League of Nations Council met urgently in Paris. This was a test case for the League's ability to prevent wars and resolve disputes peacefully. The League acted decisively. It condemned the Greek invasion and called for an immediate retreat and the withdrawal of Greek troops from Bulgarian territory. It also sent military attaches to the area to monitor the situation. Faced with strong international pressure, particularly from Great Britain and France, and the threat of sanctions, Greece had little choice but to comply. They agreed to a cate and began to withdraw their forces. A League of Nations commission was then sent to investigate the incident and its aftermath. The commission concluded that while the initial border incident was regrettable, the Greek invasion was disproportionate and unjustified. In early 1926, the League ruled that Greece was responsible for violating Bulgarian sovereignty and ordered Greece to pay an indemnity of 45,000 British pounds, considerably less than Greece had demanded from Bulgaria, but still a significant sum, to Bulgaria as compensation for the material and moral damages caused by the invasion. The War of the Stray Dog lasted only a few days, but it resulted in casualties on both sides. Estimates vary, but perhaps around 50 people were killed. It demonstrated the dangers lurking in the volatile Balkan region, and also highlighted the potential and limitations of the League of Nations in peacekeeping. All of this international drama, an invasion, and a diplomatic crisis traced back to a soldier, his dog, and a very jumpy border guard. It's a stark reminder of how easily tensions can boil over when mistrust is high, even if a wandering pet is the one to light the fuse. Number 4. The Pastry War, how unpaid croissants led to an actual armed conflict. Sounds like something from a comedy sketch. A war fought over pastries. But in 1838, France launched a naval blockade and military intervention against Mexico. And one of the key justifications, the one that gave the conflict its popular name, Guerra de los Pasteles, or the Pastry War, was the claim of a French pastry chef whose shop had been ransacked. The story begins in Mexico, in the years following its independence from Spain in 1821. The country was going through a period of significant political instability, with frequent changes in government, civil unrest, and rebellions. During these turbulent times, foreign nationals living in Mexico often suffered property damage or losses, and their claims for compensation from the Mexican government frequently went unpaid. Among the claimants were many French citizens. One of them was a Monsieur Rimontel, a French pastry chef who owned a restaurant or bakery in Tacubaya, a district of Mexico City. He alleged that in 1828, some accounts say 1832, Mexican army officers had looted his establishment, damaged his property, and most famously devoured a large quantity of his pastries without paying. Rimontel claimed damages amounting to 60,000 pesos, an enormous sum at the time, especially for pastries, suggesting his claims probably included more than just stolen eclairs and croissants, likely covering extensive damage to his business. For years, Monsieur Rimontel, along with other French nationals who had suffered various losses, ranging from businesses plundered to loans defaulted on by the Mexican government, petitioned the French government for help. By the late 1830s, King Louis-Philippe of France decided it was time to take a firm stance. France had broader commercial and diplomatic interests in Mexico, and these unpaid claims provided a convenient pretext. In early 1838, France issued an ultimatum to Mexico. They demanded that the Mexican government pay a total of 600,000 pesos to cover all the outstanding claims from French citizens, including the substantial sum for Monsieur Rimontel. The Mexican government, already struggling financially and resentful of foreign interference, refused to pay such a large amount, especially under threat. They argued the claims were exaggerated or that they were not responsible for damages caused during civil disturbances. When Mexico failed to meet the French demands, France took action. In April 1838, a French fleet under Admiral Charles Baudin arrived off the coast of Mexico and established a blockade of Mexico's principal Gulf Coast ports, most importantly, Veracruz, which was the main entry point for Mexican trade. This blockade crippled Mexican commerce and customs revenue. The standoff continued for months. Negotiations failed. Finally, in November 1838, after Mexico still refused to pay, Admiral Baudin ordered the bombardment of the fortress of San Juan de Ulloa, which guarded the harbor of Veracruz. After a fierce battle, the Mexican forces defending the fortress surrendered. French troops then occupied Veracruz. During the fighting for Veracruz, a notable figure on the Mexican side was General Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had come out of retirement, one of his many comings and goings from power, to lead the Mexican troops. In one skirmish, Santa Anna was severely wounded in the leg by French cannon fire, and his leg had to be amputated. He famously had the leg buried with full military honors, a detail that adds to the almost surreal nature of the conflict. He would later use this sacrifice to boost his political career. Conflict dragged on for a few more months, with the French maintaining their blockade and occupation of Veracruz. The Mexican economy was suffering badly. Other powers, particularly Great Britain, which had significant trading interests in Mexico, became concerned about the disruption. The British offered to mediate. Under pressure from the French military actions and British diplomatic efforts, Mexico eventually capitulated. In March 1839, a peace treaty was signed. Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos demanded by France, including the claim for Monsieur Rimontel's ravaged pastry shop. The French forces then withdrew. So the pastry war came to an end. While the plundered pastries were just one small, albeit memorable part of the larger sum demanded by France, they became the symbol of the conflict. It highlighted how relatively minor grievances, amplified by national pride and economic interests, could escalate into international warfare. And it ensured that Monsieur Remontel, the aggrieved baker, would have a unique, if somewhat sticky, place in history. Number 3. The War of Jenkins' Ear, the severed ear that sparked a 9-year naval battle. It's one of the most strangely named wars in history, and its origin story is equally bizarre and gruesome. The War of Jenkins' Ear, which raged between Great Britain and Spain from 1739 to 1748, was ostensibly triggered by a single preserved human ear, an ear that belonged to a British mariner named Robert Jenkins. The real reasons for the war were, of course, more complex, rooted in decades of trade rivalry and colonial ambition in the Americas. After the War of the Spanish Succession, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 had granted Britain a valuable concession called the Asiento de Negros. This allowed Britain the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America, and also permitted one British ship per year, the annual ship, to trade a limited amount of goods with Spanish colonies. However, British merchants, eager for more access to the lucrative Spanish-American markets, engaged in widespread smuggling and illegal trading, far exceeding the treaty's limits. Spain naturally tried to protect its colonial trade monopoly. They authorized Spanish privateers and coast guards, known as guarda costas, to board and inspect British ships in Caribbean waters to check for contraband. These encounters were often rough. British sailors complained of mistreatment, seizure of their goods, and violence at the hands of the Spanish. The Spanish, in turn, accused the British of persistent, illegal trading and provocation. Enter Captain Robert Jenkins. He was the master of a British brig named the Rebecca. According to Jenkins' own account, in April 1731, his ship was stopped and boarded off the coast of Havana, Cuba, by a Spanish guardacosta called La Isabela, commanded by Julio Leon Fandino. Jenkins claimed that after his ship was plundered, Fandino's men tied him to a mast, and then Fandino himself, or one of his officers, sliced off Jenkins' left ear with a sword. As the story goes, Fandino then mockingly told Jenkins to take the severed ear back to England and give it to thy king, and tell him that I will do the same to him, if he dares to do the same. Jenkins, resourceful and perhaps keen on preserving evidence, supposedly pickled his detached ear in a jar of spirits. For 7 years, the incident remained relatively obscure. Jenkins continued his seafaring career. But by 1738, political tensions between Britain and Spain were reaching a boiling point. In Britain, there was a powerful political faction, the Patriots, who were agitating for war against Spain to defend British honor, and more importantly, to force open Spanish colonial markets for British trade. This faction was opposed to the more peace-inclined Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. The war party needed a powerful symbol to rally public opinion, and Robert Jenkins, with his preserved ear and his dramatic story, was perfect. In March 1738, Jenkins was brought before a committee of the British House of Commons. It's said that he dramatically produced the shriveled brown object, his ear, for the parliamentarians to see, though some historians debate whether he actually displayed the ear or just recounted his tale with great passion. Regardless, his testimony, vividly describing the Spanish cruelty, caused an uproar. The story of Jenkins' ear spread like wildfire through pamphlets and newspapers, fueling public outrage and calls for revenge against Spanish depredations. The pressure on Prime Minister Walpole became immense. Despite his efforts to find a diplomatic solution, the warhawks, supported by merchants and a jingoistic public, won the day. In October 1739, Great Britain officially declared war on Spain. This conflict, initially known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, soon became entangled with a much larger European conflict, the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, with Britain and Spain finding themselves on opposing sides in that wider struggle as well. The War of Jenkins' Ear was primarily a naval and colonial war, fought mainly in the Caribbean and along the coasts of Spanish America. There were major amphibious operations, such as the British attack on Portobello in Panama in 1739, a significant early British victory that made Admiral Edward Vernon a hero and the disastrous British a Tabriz, the Arbor. Fighting also occurred in Georgia and Florida between British colonists and Spanish forces. The war dragged on for 9 years, with varying fortunes for both sides, and cost thousands of lives. It eventually ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, which largely restored the pre-war territorial situation. The Asiento was renewed for a few more years, but the underlying issues of trade and colonial boundaries remained largely unresolved, festering until future conflicts. As for Robert Jenkins, he was given command of a ship in the British East India Company's service, and later became a supervisor of the company's establishment in St. Helena. He seems to have faded from public view after his brief moment of fame, but his ear, or at least the story of it, achieved a peculiar kind of immortality forever linked to a major international war that it helped to ignite, a stark reminder of how a single vivid human story, true or embellished, can become a powerful catalyst in the hands of those pushing for conflict. Number 2. The football war, the Suldying match, that kicked off a real war. Can a simple game of soccer actually start a war? In the summer of 1969, that's exactly what seemed to happen between two Central American neighbors, El Salvador and Honduras. Conflict became famously known as the La Guerra del Fútbol, or the Football War, or Suldying War. While the soccer matches were the immediate flashpoint that ignited public fury, the true causes ran much deeper, involving decades of social, economic, and demographic tensions. The war itself, though brief, was brutal. For years, El Salvador, the smallest and most densely populated country in Central America, had faced significant land shortages and overpopulation. Many Salvadorians, seeking land and economic opportunities, had migrated to neighboring Honduras, which was larger and less densely populated. By the late 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians were living in Honduras, many of them as undocumented squatters on Honduran land. This mass migration created resentment in Honduras. Honduran peasants felt that Salvadoran immigrants were taking their land and jobs. In 1969, the Honduran government, under pressure from landowners and peasant groups, passed a new land reform law. While ostensibly aimed at redistributing land more equitably among Honduran peasants, the law was also used to evict Salvadoran settlers and expropriate their property. Thousands of Salvadorans were forced to flee Honduras and return to El Salvador, often with harrowing stories of persecution. This created a refugee crisis in El Salvador and inflamed tensions between the two governments. Against this backdrop of rising anger and nationalism, El Salvador and Honduras were drawn to play each other in a 3-game qualifying round for the 1970 FIFA World Cup. Sport, which can often be a unifying force in this case, became a potent outlet for nationalistic passions. The first game was played in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras, on June 8, 1969. Honduras won 1-0. The night before the match, Salvadoran players were reportedly harassed, kept awake by noisy crowds outside their hotel. After the game, there were reports of violence against Salvadoran fans. The second game took place a week later, on June 15, in San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. This time, It was the Honduran team and their fans who faced a hostile environment. El Salvador won the match 3-0. After this game, violence escalated significantly. There were attacks on Honduran fans, and the Honduran flag was desecrated. Back in Honduras, there were retaliatory attacks against Salvadoran residents. The media in both countries played a major role in fanning the flames, with sensationalized reporting and nationalistic propaganda. Stories of atrocities, some real, some exaggerated or fabricated, filled the airwaves and newspapers, whipping up public hatred. With each team having won one home game, a deciding playoff match was needed. It was scheduled for June 27th in Mexico City, a neutral venue. El Salvador won this crucial game 3-2 in extra time, securing their place in the World Cup. While the match itself was tense, the real drama was unfolding back home. Immediately after El Salvador's victory, diplomatic relations between the two countries were severed. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Border skirmishes. Both governments accused each other of aggression and atrocities. On July 14, 1969, less than 3 weeks after the final soccer match, the Salvadoran military launched an invasion of Honduras. The Salvadoran Air Force bombed Honduran targets, including Tuncuntun International Airport in Tegucigalpa, and Salvadoran ground troops crossed the border, advancing several kilometers into Honduran territory. The conflict, which became known as the 100-hour war due to its short duration, was intense. Both sides used their relatively small air forces to bomb military and some civilian targets. There was fierce fighting on the ground. The Organization of American States, OAS, quickly intervened, calling for an immediate catch-rate and the withdrawal of Salvadoran troops. Under pressure from the OAS and facing logistical problems and stiffer than expected Honduran resistance, El Salvador agreed to a quete on July 18th. Salvadoran troops began to withdraw in early August, though not without significant diplomatic wrangling. The football war, though short, had devastating consequences. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it's believed that between 1,000 and 4,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed. Tens of thousands, perhaps over 100,000 Salvadorans were displaced from Honduras, either before or during the war, creating a massive refugee problem for El Salvador and further straining its already burdened economy and social fabric. Trade between the two countries was disrupted for years, and the border remained officially closed for over a decade. While the soccer matches were the highly visible trigger, the war was a tragic explosion of long simmering issues: land disputes, migration, demographic pressures, nationalism, and political manipulation. The beautiful game, in this instance, became intertwined with a very ugly conflict, a stark reminder that sport can sometimes become a battleground for much larger societal and political struggles. Peace wasn't formally agreed until 1980, and the border dispute that partly underpinned the tensions wasn't fully resolved by the International Court of Justice until 1992. Number 1. The War of the Bucket. The time two Italian city-states fought a bloody war over a stolen bucket. It sounds almost like a playground squabble blown completely out of proportion. A war fought over a stolen wooden, but in 14th century Italy, this was no joke. The War of the Bucket, or Guerra della Secchia Rapita, was a very real and very bloody conflict in 1325 between the rival northern Italian city-states of Modena and Bologna. And yes, a simple oak bucket was, at least symbolically, at the heart of it. To understand how a bucket could lead to such mayhem, we need to picture Italy in the Middle Ages. It wasn't a unified country like it is today. Instead, It was a patchwork of powerful, independent city-states, each with its own ambitions, rivalries, and alliances. A major political division across much of Italy was the struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Broadly speaking, the Guelphs supported the Pope, while the Ghibellines backed the Holy Roman Emperor. These allegiances often shifted and were complicated by local feuds, but they provided a constant source of tension and conflict. Bologna was a prominent Guelph city, fiercely loyal to the papacy. Modena, its neighbor, was a staunchly Ghibelline stronghold, often at odds with Bologna. For decades, even centuries, these two cities, along with others in the region, had been engaged in a series of skirmishes, raids, and outright wars. They disputed territory, trade routes, and political influence. So the atmosphere was already charged with animosity. The story of the bucket itself is a mix of fact and legend, but the traditional account goes like this. Sometime in 1325, a band of Modenese soldiers, perhaps on a daring nighttime raid, sneaked into the city of Bologna. Their mission wasn't to conquer or pillage on a grand scale, but to commit an act of petty, taunting theft. They allegedly made their way to a public well in the center of Bologna, drew up a wooden bucket filled with water, and then made off with the bucket itself, carrying it back to Modena as a trophy. When the Bolognese discovered their civic bucket was missing, they were, to put it mildly, outraged. It wasn't about the monetary value of an old wooden bucket. It was about the insult, the humiliation, the brazen mockery by their hated Modenese rivals. The bucket became a symbol of Bolognese honor. They demanded its immediate return. The Modenese, proud of their audacious prank and eager to rub salt in Bologna's wounds, refused. They displayed the stolen bucket triumphantly in Modena. This refusal was the final straw for Bologna. Fueled by years of pent-up resentment, and now this fresh insult, Bologna declared war on Modena. Both cities mobilized their forces. Bologna, being larger and wealthier, managed to assemble a substantial army, perhaps around 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, including allies from other Guelph cities like Florence. Modena, though smaller, also raised a significant Ghibelline force, possibly around 5,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, with support from powerful Ghibelline lords like Rinaldo Passerino Bonacolsi, the Lord of Mantua, who became the commander of the Ghibelline forces. The two armies met on November 15, 1325, at Zappolino, a small village in the territory disputed between the two cities, just a few miles from Bologna. The ensuing Battle of Zappolino was surprisingly fierce and bloody for a conflict sparked by a... Despite being outnumbered, the Ghibelline forces of Modena, under Bonacolsi's skilled command, launched a determined attack. The battle raged for several hours. In the end, Modena achieved a stunning victory. The Bolognese army was routed. Thousands were killed on both sides. Estimates suggest around 2,000 casualties in total. The Modenese pursued the fleeing Bolognese right up to the gates of Bologna, taunting them and devastating the surrounding countryside. But they did not attempt to capture the city itself. And what of the bucket? The Modenese, victorious in battle, proudly kept their stolen prize. The original bucket, or at least one believed to be the original, was displayed for centuries in the bell tower of Modena's cathedral, the Ghirlandina, as a symbol of their triumph and Bolognese humiliation. Today, a replica of that famous bucket is still kept in the Palazzo Comunale town hall of Modena, a curious tourist attraction and a reminder of this bizarre episode. While the stolen bucket provided the immediate and most memorable pretext for the war, the 1325 conflict was really just one violent chapter in the long and complex saga and intercity warfare in medieval Italy. However, the sheer pettiness of the supposed casus belli, the bucket, immortalized this particular war. The 17th century Italian poet Alessandro Tassoni even wrote a famous mock heroic epic poem about it, La Secchia Repita, the stolen bucket, which further cemented its legendary status. It serves as a striking, if somewhat comical example, of how even the most trivial-seeming objects or incidents can become potent symbols, capable of igniting deadly conflict when deeper animosities are already simmering.